Today's sermon is titled Inside the Story by Reverend Ken Reed Brown. Reverend Ken Reed Brown retired this past summer following 35 years as a minister of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation First Parish in Hingham, Massachusetts, also known as Old Ship Church. Prior to his ministry at Old Ship, Ken served as the Associate Director of Cambridge Forum in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Ken holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Haverford College and his Master of Divinity degree from Starr King School for the Ministry in Berkeley, California. Ken continues to live in Hingham with his wife, Susan. They have 3 grown children and 5 grandsons, ages 1 month to 7 years, with 1 more grandchild on the way this February. He has been spending some of his retirement time recording kid songs for the grandchildren, accompanying himself on banjo, guitar, and mandolin. May I present my old friend, Reverend Ken Reed Brown.
Thank you, Marianne. Very much, Sunny, as we knew you back in the day. It's great to see you and great to see everyone. Great to be with you, even though I'm 2 or 3 time zones away. Wonderful to be with you again, I think for the 4th time. And though I'm not in our old ship meeting house anymore, I just have this postcard drawn, created by one of our members years ago. Anyway, really good to be with you again. Thanks to Marianne for making the connection to begin with several years ago and for hosting again as our worship associate, and to all those who make worship possible today, and other Mary and Randy, Andy, and whomever else that I don't know who makes it all possible. And special thanks, Marianne, for your kindness in lighting the candle of remembrance for Jim. I miss him a lot, as we all do who knew him and loved him. Inside the story, poet Muriel Rukeyser once wrote that the universe is made of stories, not atoms. Stories, not atoms. So with that in mind, my sermon, Inside the Story. My grandmother died when I was, I think, 8 or 9, 11, 10, 11, I'm not sure, just about that time. Grandma had traveled out to St. Louis to visit some family members that she hadn't seen in a long time. And while she was there, she began having symptoms that clearly were symptoms of a heart attack, and she kind of let it go a little bit too long. So found herself in the hospital. My father, her son, Dad was a physician as well as her son, and went out to be with her at her bedside during what turned out to be her last days. Upon his return, Dad told us that from her hospital bed, Grandma wondered what would become of her grandchildren, her 3 grandsons, my 2 older brothers and myself. What would we do? Who would we be as we got older? For the story of her life was coming to an end, as she knew, just as our lives were pretty much near the beginning. And she was curious, naturally enough, even though realizing she wouldn't see how our lives unfolded and so on. She was curious, as quite natural. And decades later, indeed, when my father was living his last days, he too wondered what would become of his grandchildren, of his children for that matter too, who were by then young adults. A natural curiosity. This is, after all, how the wheel of life turns and turns again. Beginnings, middles, and endings of our lives all kind of mixed, woven together. Billy Collins, wonderful poet, has a poignantly delightful poem that he titled Aristotle, alluding to the philosopher's writings on the nature of poetics and drama. Collins' poem is too long to read in its entirety, but it begins with these words. He wrote, "This is the beginning. Almost anything can happen. This is where you find the creation of light, a fish wriggling onto land, the first word of Paradise Lost on an empty page. This is the first part where the wheels begin to turn." And then the second stanza includes these words. This is the middle. Things have had time to get complicated. Messy, really. Nothing is simple anymore. Colin goes on to elaborate in that middle part of the poem all the ways in which our lives, or our drama for that matter, or an opera or a book, get complicated. That's what makes it interesting. Then the final stanza includes these lines, poignant lines. He wrote, "And this is the end. The car running out of road, the river losing its name in an ocean, the empty wheelchair. This is the end, according to Aristotle, what we have all been waiting for, what everything comes down to." But here's the thing, as we know, the middle, many middles actually always still go on somewhere, though we may be at the same time marking apparent beginnings and or endings. The middles are always going on too. After all, we are born, our individual beginnings, in the midst of the middles of millions of other lives who follow us. And when we die, we leave behind the middles of millions of other lives of those who follow us. In other words, we will never see or experience how things all turn out when everything comes down to, in Billy Collins' words. And we certainly can't know ahead of time how things will go. After all, we live inside the story. Can't read ahead to the end of a novel or the last words of the final act of a play to get to the end. We can't know how our own lives will go. Well, what about the stories of myth and legend, such as the stories told and shared at this time of year? Stories I surely don't take mostly as accurate history. I expect you don't either. But is there value to trying to get inside those stories as if they were our own personal stories? Tonight, for example, is the first night of Hanukkah, as you know. The word means dedication. And the festival, as I expect you all also know, recognizes, remembers, tells the story of the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem at the end of the war, when the Maccabees had defeated the Seleucid king and his forces, King Antiochus. It was a rededication as well to their religious faith and to the idea of their freedom to worship as they chose in their own way. I mean, there's the story of the miracle of the candles and so on, but this idea of dedication is at the heart of the story. And this all happened a long time ago, but if we use our imagination to get inside the story, we may see how it reflects, this old story reflects some dimensions of our own lives, personally and collectively, certainly. Our struggles with forces and systems of oppression, efforts to seek peace, our resolve to live our values without some arbitrary oppressive authority telling us what we must believe or how we must live. When we see this played out all around the planet, including in our own nation, but certainly quite devastatingly in places like Ukraine and elsewhere, Iran and so on. I love Lynn Ungar, one of my colleagues. She's a Unitarian Universalist minister, that first source of the first reading. I love her way of inviting us into this story, inviting us, as she put it, to settle into a life beyond fear, to, quote, declare your presence, your loyalties, the truths for which you do not expect to have to die. Seems to me this all sounds pretty relevant to our shared lives these days, our shared stories, doesn't it? And 6 days from now on Christmas Eve, another story will be told. The nativity story from the Gospel of Luke will be read in thousands of churches once again. Sure, we already know how this story goes and how the baby's life will go. In fact, right till the end, the last chapter and verse, at least as the story is told. We've read the book or heard the story, not to mention the ripples of the story for centuries beyond his life and death. But if we take the story seriously, which is not to say literally, if we take it seriously, the shepherds didn't know any of that. Mary and Joseph didn't know any of that. The three kings or magi, they didn't know any of that. None of them knew or had any sense of how the story might end. In fact, whether history or legend, the story becomes more powerful, I think, if we allow ourselves or invite ourselves to enter into the story, get inside the story as much as possible, sort of pretending that we, like the shepherds and the rest of them, don't know how it's going to go, how it's going to turn out. This is one of the reasons I found the Christmas pageant, as for many years we presented it at our Old Ship Church, was done. We invited anyone who wished, at any age, adults, kids, on the spot, to choose. We had costumes ready to choose to be a shepherd or to be one of the wise men or wise ones, as we call them, to be an angel, to be a star, and then to enter into the story as we told the story in our own Unitarian Universalist way. So to become one of the characters in the story. So you carry a shepherd's crook, wear a wise one's crown or an angel's halo. Perhaps imagine what it was like to be the innkeeper, or Mary or Joseph, with no place to lay their heads, and having their baby far from home, finding their place in a stable of all places. You're invited to enter into the story, maybe discovering something fresh about your own story as you do so, as the second reading suggested so beautifully. For example, have you ever had the experience of metaphorically, maybe literally, as you needed a place to stay, of finding there was no room at the inn, or not being welcome in some other context, not being invited, seen as other for whatever reason? Maybe it was a childhood memory, or maybe something more recent. And this perhaps while everyone around you seemed to be quite welcome. Or some of you right now, like the shepherds tending their sheep, where you are in the midst of tenderly caring for a dear one, a family friend or a family member, or a friend of yours who is in the midst of trial or suffering or illness. It's a task, as we all know, sometimes often filled with worries, fears, concerns, and often not knowing how things will go, how they'll turn out. Or maybe like the wise ones, you've been seeking the holy on a path of seeking meaning in whatever way you articulate it. On this path, sometimes there are dry places like a desert. And maybe not everybody understands your quest. And in this culture so driven by success, as the culture defines it, and money and so on, people not understanding. I don't know about you, but I can relate to just about all these dimensions of the story. So yes, entering into the age-old nativity story may indeed help us get inside the meanings of our individual stories, journeys, struggles, maybe even including feelings and emotions of this particular season, here and now, that we might have. The fear of the shepherds, the worry of the parents, the discouragement of finding no room at the inn, but the desire for finding some sacredness, some lift. And it may, some parts of your journey during this season may have little to do, or seem to have little to do, with the joy of the angels singing, joy that we're all somehow supposed to feel this season. Yet their joy, the angels' joy, is somehow part of the story too. Maybe, I hope, part of your story this season, our story, part of ours, since we know that none of our stories are all joy all the time. This is, after all, in the nature of things, isn't it? This blend of sorrow and joy that marks our lives. The revered Vietnamese Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh of blessed memory, in a commentary on a Buddhist text, outlines what he called 11 guides for daily living. And tellingly, every one way or another, each guide encourages us not to wish for no trouble, no obstacles, no challenges, no difficult relationships. And why not? Because he reminds us, if we need reminding, that it is often through, in the midst of obstacles, challenges, and so on, that we grow, that we learn, and perhaps shed layers of ego and self-righteousness, that we deepen our compassion and commitment to helping others who have also worried, feared, faced daunting challenges, and so on, and perhaps find joy in the midst of it all. These are not incompatible, our struggles and our joy. Sometimes we find joy in the midst of struggle and challenge, all of which was maybe going on in that stable, fictional or otherwise, in that stable over 2,000 years ago, this blend of joy and worry and concern and Who knows what's going to happen? Or as my father once said to my brother Jim, in the midst of a period of time that Jim was in which Jim was facing some struggle and challenge, Dad said, "Welcome to the human race, where troubles in some measure come with the territory, along with measures of joy too." Well, what then, in the midst of troubles and challenges and obstacles, Aristotle's and Billy Collins' middle of the story, after all, where most of the action takes place, after all, where things have gotten quite complicated indeed, as Collins writes, and some of what I did not quote earlier, the middle, quote, teeming with people at cross purposes, the middle where, quote, disappointment unshoulders his knapsack, the sticky part where the plot congeals, where, quote, quoting again, here the aria rises to a pitch, a song of betrayal salted with revenge, and so on. What then? What then? And how then? Well, maybe it's simple, maybe, which is not to say easy. Here's what I mean. As we've said this morning, and as we know, we can't and don't know how it will all turn out, what the future will bring. But here's the thing, we can know and do know what we can bring to this moment and the next as we live into the future. We know what we can resolve to bring, what we can strive to bring as we live into the future of our story and our shared stories. Simply do the best we can, bring as much kindness and compassion and love to whatever we do, with a sort of leap of faith inside the story, since we don't know how things will go. It seems to me it's what each of the characters in both the stories that I've shared this morning did. A leap of faith with dedication, the highest of values, and with love. Kind of head and heart here. Perseverance, and generosity, and love. We can't control the outcome. We know this, though we too often forget it. And we will never know how everything turns out, because actually everything just goes on. Not just 3 acts or 5, and not just in our personal lives, but in the larger life we share in our nation and on the planet, in the midst of so much crisis now, from war to climate crisis and so on. Or as I said at the outset, we're born into not just our own story, but into all sorts of stories, millions of them already in progress. And when we leave the stage, millions of stories will still be going on, will go on, from the personal to the political and the global. Stories, some of them still in the middle or just beginning, on the wheel turns. We come to terms with this, learn to live with it, we better. And we come to terms with knowing only some things turn out, never everything, before our story ends. And my grandmother come to terms with it, my father, I don't know, I hope so. Can we come to terms with how the end of one story becomes the beginning of another, how all the stories are mixed and blended together, never turning out once and for all, following Aristotle's outline? Well, why not? This is, after all, the truth of our lives, our personal lives, and as I said, our shared life on the nation and the planet, that we are each more than our individual stories, each part of the whole fabric of humanity, of universe, of cosmos, each sort of thrown off as a spark of the universe, of the divine, using that language if you choose. So why not then this season and all the seasons of our lives, why not bring to our living the spirit of dedication to our most cherished values that we can absorb from the story of Hanukkah this year and every year and always? And why not absorb the spirit of love in the midst of all the more essential, in the midst of worries and fears and challenges that we can absorb from the story and the image of that story of the Nativity so many years ago. Dedication and love, passed from generation to generation, hand to hand, heart to heart, from grandmother to father to child, in the continuing complex and beautiful stories of our lives. Why not? May it be so. Blessed be.